So to start off our next unit, we're going to look at 1 and 2 variable data. The graphs in the table shown here provide information about Canadian women's university hockey points leaders in the 2006 to 2007 season. So the first graph that we have is a bar graph. And from the title we can see that this is giving us the penalty minutes for the top scorers. The second graph. So the second graph is a scatter plot. And you can see this is comparing the number of penalty minutes and goals scored. And we also have a table. And the table gives us multiple sets of information. Player's name, the number of games they played, goals, assists, and points. Can you create a question that can be answered from the bar graph? So again, looking back at the bar graph, we can see we have the penalty minutes for the top scorers. So you can create any question that you choose. So maybe it's which players had more than 20 penalty minutes. Next, can you create a question that can be answered from the scatter plot? And it could be how many players scored more than 20 goals and had more than 20 penalty minutes. And from the table, there's a whole series of questions. So from the table, for example, how many players played 24 games? So next part, only one of the graphs displays what we call 2 variable data. Which one do you think it is and why? So the only one that does is the scatter plot. And that is because there are 2 different variables that are being measured, the penalty minutes and the goals scored. And notice the bar graph is only measuring the number of penalty minutes. So therefore, the bar graph is what we call 1 variable data. So let's go through a bit of terminology. So in statistics, a variable is an attribute that can be measured. So 1 variable data gives measures of 1 attribute, and you can recognize 1 variable data when you see, so first, our tally charts. You're keeping track of how many people like a certain food. Then we have frequency tables, bar graphs, histograms, which are similar to bar graphs, pictograms, and our pie graphs or circle graphs. So those will usually represent 1 variable data. 2 variable data sets give the measure of 2 attributes. So you can recognize 2 variable situations when you see ordered pairs. So when you think about x, y values on a scatter plot, of course that means our scatter plots are also a way to recognize 2 variable data. And 2 or more column table values. So like above, maybe it's points scored and assists for a player. So there'll be 2 columns for table values. Example 1. State whether each situation involves one variable or two variable data, and justify your answers. So Liam researches the annual hours of sunshine in Canadian cities. So Liam in this case is measuring one variable. And that is hours of sunshine. Note, Canadian cities are not being measured. Canadian cities are just given a name. We're not measuring them. We're not putting a number attached to that. But we are attaching a number to the hours of sunshine for each of those cities. B. A study compares the length of time children spend playing video games and the time they spend reading. So in this case, the study is measuring two variables. And they are the time playing video games and the time reading. And final one, a researcher wants to determine if there's a correlation between the drop height of a roller coaster and its top speed. So once again, we see we are measuring two variables. And these variables are the drop height and top speed. Alright, so deciding which graph to draw. For example 2, for a class project, Tyson surveyed students about their part-time jobs. What type of graph would best show how many hours each student worked on the weekend? So since we're only looking at one variable, hours the student worked, a bar graph would best display all the information. What type of graph would best show a possible relationship between weekday and weekend hours? So key thing, we have two variables we're looking at. We're comparing weekday and weekend hours. So two sets of data per student. So that would mean that a scatter plot could show the possible relationship between weekday and weekend hours, since each point on the scatter plot would display two pieces of information about the student. And example 3, our last example. Identify graphs involving one and two variable data. So what we have here is what we call a histogram. And the variable that we're measuring in this histogram is the budget. So this means we have one variable data. So the only thing we're measuring in this example is the budget. All right, we can see that B is what we call our scatter plot. And a scatter plot usually means that we have two variable data. The scatter plot here is showing their IQ as one variable versus the brain size. So in this case, we can say we have two variable data. For each person, we're measuring a performance IQ and the brain size in pixels. And the last one, again, we're looking at a bar graph. And we're looking at the percent of people who are alive or dead. Now some people might say this is two variable data, but we're not plotting them as an XY axis. We're taking the blue graphs to be those percentages that are alive. And of course, the remaining percentage would be the ones that die. So really, we're just measuring one variable data, or we're just plotting one variable data. So again, if you see a bar graph, that represents one variable data. If you see a histogram, that's one variable. And if we see a scatter plot, That will be 2 variable data. Again, here are some questions that you can try.